In a deadly clash over the Bismarck Sea, the B-25 Mitchell bombers, with their 8-gun noses, unleashed an unprecedented wave of destruction, shattering the Japanese Navy's confidence and forever changing naval warfare. March 3, 1943, 0600 hours, the Bismarck Sea. Rear Admiral Masatoy Kimura stood confidently on the bridge of his flagship, overseeing a convoy of 8 destroyers and 8 fully loaded transport ships. These ships, carrying the vital 51st Division reinforcements, were making their way through waters that the Japanese Navy believed belonged to their empire. The convoy, heavily escorted and well-prepared, was under Kimura's watchful command, and he had every reason to believe the operation would be a success. After all, Japanese naval forces had sailed these waters unchallenged for over a year, and the Americans had not yet posed a serious threat. The convoy's mission was critical. 6,900 soldiers, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and the hopes of a weary army, were set to reinforce the Japanese position at Lane. To Kimura, this mission was simply another routine voyage. His faith in the superiority of the Japanese fleet, backed by years of victorious naval engagements, made him confident that the American forces would not dare strike in these familiar waters. But what Kimura could not foresee, what no Japanese officer could even imagine, was a storm that was about to break over his fleet, one that would change the course of naval warfare forever. As the convoy cruised towards its destination, the Japanese Navy's belief in their superiority was palpable. The destroyers formed a tight perimeter around the transport ships, maintaining their formation as they navigated the Bismarck Sea with the utmost confidence. The crews, well-drilled in anti-aircraft tactics, had honed their skills through months of defending their vessels against American air raids. They were prepared for the usual high-altitude bombing runs from B-17 Flying Fortress bombers and the occasional torpedo attack, both of which had been successfully countered before. To the Japanese, these tactics were predictable, manageable even. They had learned to respond quickly to the threat of high-altitude bombers, firing up their 25mm cannons and 5-inch dual-purpose guns in unison to protect their ships. The air defense strategies were clear. When the Americans came, they would come from above, just as they always had. But as the first American aircraft appeared on the horizon, the scene that unfolded before the Japanese was unlike anything they had ever encountered. At first, the destroyers detected the familiar silhouette of B-17 bombers, flying high at 7,000 feet. The Japanese gunners swung their weapons toward the incoming planes, preparing to unleash their concentrated fire. However, just as the destroyer crews began to engage the bombers, a new threat emerged from below. B-25 Mitchell bombers, not soaring at high altitude, but skimming just above the waves. Modified in a way no one could have imagined, these B-25s carried an arsenal of 8.50 caliber machine guns protruding from their noses like the fangs of a mechanical demon. Their approach was so low that their propellers stirred the surface of the ocean, sending sprays of water flying into the air. This was not the type of attack the Japanese had been trained for. As the B-25s barreled towards their targets at an astonishing speed, the Japanese sailors were frozen with shock. In a matter of seconds, these bombers, armed with a devastating new weapon, would shatter the illusion of invulnerability that the Japanese Navy had so carefully cultivated. The impact of the B-25's attack was immediate and catastrophic. Major Edward Lner, flying the lead B-25 nicknamed Ruthless, led the charge, his bomber roaring across the water at 280 miles per hour. As he closed in on the destroyer Shiryuki, the Japanese sailors on deck could only stare in disbelief at the approaching aircraft. The sight of the 8 machine guns, lined up in the bomber's nose, seemed almost otherworldly, like a creature designed solely for destruction. At 1,200 yards, Lner squeezed the trigger, and instantly, streams of 50 caliber bullets erupted from the B-25, lighting up the sky in a blaze of tracer rounds. Each gun fired a barrage of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each one traveling at 2,910 feet per second, faster than the human eye could track. The bullets ripped through the thin armor of the Shiryuki, punching holes in the bridge and superstructure. The windows of the bridge exploded in showers of glass, and the Japanese officers manning the ship's defenses were shredded by the incoming fire. The anti-aircraft guns, which had been the last line of defense, fell silent as their crews were torn apart. The devastation was almost instantaneous, as a high-powered machine gun fire reduced the Shiryuki to a mass of twisted metal and burning wreckage. In just 8 seconds of fire, Over 900 rounds were unleashed on the destroyer, turning it into a floating death trap. As Luna pulled up, releasing two 500-pound bombs that skipped across the water, the Shiryuki was already sinking. The impact of the bombs, coupled with a sustained strafing fire, tore the ship's hull apart, flooding its engine rooms and sealing its fate. As the B-25's continued their assault, the scene in the Bismarck Sea grew even more chaotic. The modified bombers streaked through the sky, their 8-gun noses spitting death at the Japanese ships. The Shiryuki's crew, many of them already dead, had left behind a ghostly silence as the ship began its final descent into the sea. The Japanese Navy had no response, no countermeasure against the relentless strafing. The feeling of helplessness was palpable. The soldiers and sailors who had once believed their superiority on the seas would keep them safe were now the ones being hunted. With every pass, the B-25's brought an unimaginable level of destruction, far beyond what the Japanese had ever anticipated. The transformation of the B-25 from a medium bomber into a flying gunship was a game-changer, one that would forever alter the dynamics of naval combat in the Pacific. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was profound and immediate. For over a year, the Japanese forces had sailed unchallenged through these waters, holding an overwhelming sense of superiority. The confidence they had built from their past victories, including Pearl Harbor and the Java Sea, was a foundation upon which their naval doctrine was based. The sailors believed in their ability to defend against aerial threats through rapid evasive maneuvers and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The convoy's destroyers were prepared for the predictable high-altitude bombings they had already encountered and successfully repelled. But the reality of the B-25 strafers struck like a thunderbolt, devastating their sense of security. As the B-25s approached from wave-top height, there was no time for reaction. Unlike traditional bombers that came from above, the B-25s arrived low, skimming the surface, and attacked with deadly speed and precision. The sailors on deck were not accustomed to seeing aircraft approach at such a low altitude, and they were caught completely off guard. The immense psychological toll of facing this unprecedented threat was immediate. Gun crews were overwhelmed, frozen by the sheer power of the assault. Their confidence, built on years of training, was shattered in an instant as they realized their usual countermeasures were utterly ineffective. Sailors who survived the initial assault described the attack as being trapped in a mechanical nightmare. The terror didn't just come from the violence of the attack, but from the complete breakdown of what the Japanese Navy thought they knew about warfare. The B-25's strafing runs, firing a relentless barrage of 50 caliber rounds, were unlike anything they had faced before. No amount of training could have prepared them for the speed with which these bombers tore apart their defenses. As sailors saw their comrades torn to pieces, their confidence was replaced with fear. The Shiryuki became a symbol of this psychological breakdown. The once proud destroyer was reduced to a burning, sinking wreck, and its crew, many of whom had survived other attacks, now faced an enemy they had no understanding of. The psychological toll would linger long after the physical destruction. Survivors would carry the trauma of that day throughout the war, haunted by the terror they had experienced. The B-25 strafers had not only crippled the Japanese Navy physically but mentally as well. The psychological scars of that battle would redefine how the Japanese Navy approached every future engagement in the Pacific. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell bomber into a strafing gunship was one of the most innovative and effective military adaptations of World War II. Born from necessity and fueled by a desire to overcome the limitations of conventional bombing, the B-25 modification redefined aerial combat tactics. Major Paul Levin Gunn, an Army Air Forces officer with a deep understanding of both aviation and naval warfare, recognized that traditional high-altitude bombing was inefficient when attacking fast-moving ships. Bombing from such heights made it nearly impossible to hit moving targets accurately, and torpedo attacks required specialized training that the Army Air Forces lacked in the Pacific theater. Gunn's solution was simple but revolutionary: modify the B-25 medium bomber to carry 8 forward-facing machine guns in its nose, turning it into a flying gunship capable of delivering precise, rapid fire at low altitudes. The conversion of the B-25 was no small feat. Major Gunn worked alongside Jack Fox from North American Aviation to modify the aircraft at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia. The B-25, originally designed as a medium bomber, was not built to carry such heavy firepower at the front of the aircraft. The team had to reinforce the nose structure to support the weight of the 8.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. Additionally, the aircraft's ammunition storage needed to be expanded to accommodate the massive amount of firepower that would be unleashed in a short amount of time. Despite the technical challenges, the team succeeded in creating a bomber that could deliver destruction with unrelenting speed and precision. The result was an aircraft unlike anything the Japanese Navy had encountered. The modified B-25’s, which could fire 6,800 rounds per minute, were capable of piercing the steel of Japanese warships with ease. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, traveling at a staggering 2,910 feet per second, could tear through the superstructure of a ship, setting it alight and incapacitating its crew before they could react. The B-25's new role as a strafing gunship was a stark departure from conventional bombing methods that had been relied upon throughout the war. Its ability to attack ships at low altitudes with precision and overwhelming firepower gave it a distinct advantage over traditional bombers. The B-25 could approach at wave-top height, below the reach of most anti-aircraft defenses, and unleash a hail of bullets at a rate that no ship could withstand. The tactical effectiveness of the B-25's was demonstrated almost immediately during the attack on the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. The modified bombers, operating at low altitudes, were able to deliver massive damage to the convoy with minimal risk to themselves. While the Japanese gunners focused on the high-altitude bombers, the B-25 strafers swooped in from below, catching the enemy completely off guard. The sight of these bombers, with their 8 guns firing in perfect synchronization, was terrifying. The shock and awe generated by the strafing attacks had a profound psychological effect on the Japanese sailors, leaving them unable to defend themselves against the onslaught. The development of the B-25 strafers also had far-reaching implications beyond the Bismarck Sea. The success of these modified bombers prompted the U.S. military to continue refining and expanding the concept. By the end of 1943, B-25 units had been fully converted to strafing gunships, with the aircraft becoming standard equipment for attacks on Japanese convoys and other naval targets throughout the Pacific. The 8-gun nose modification became a hallmark of American ingenuity and adaptability, proving that field modifications could often be more effective than the most advanced purpose-built weapons. The B-25's were not just a technological breakthrough. They were a symbol of how American forces could adapt to the realities of war and turn a conventional bomber into a weapon of overwhelming destruction. As the B-25 Mitchell bombers, modified into lethal strafing gunships, continued their attack on the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea, the shock and disbelief among the Japanese sailors grew exponentially. The attack, although brief, was devastating. The initial surprise had been overwhelming. The Japanese Navy, which had long held the belief that high-altitude bombers and torpedo planes were the primary aerial threats, was completely unprepared for the arrival of the low-flying B-25's. These bombers came at wave-top height, so low that their propellers kicked up water, creating a visible trail on the ocean surface. The Japanese Navy, relying heavily on their anti-aircraft defenses and evasive maneuvers of protection, was caught entirely off guard. This was not the kind of threat they had been trained to counter. The surprise element of the attack was further compounded by the B-25's speed and firepower. As the bombers approached, their 8 forward-facing .50 caliber machine guns began firing, instantly transforming the calm seas into a hellish landscape. The tracer rounds lit up the sky, marking the death of each ship with streaks of light. Japanese sailors had expected conventional bombing run, but instead they faced a strafing assault that left little room for escape. The B-25 did not follow any traditional bombing patterns. There was no long approach, no gradual descent. They came in fast, low, and direct, with the entire focus of the attack aimed squarely at the ships. The Japanese gun crews, who had practiced for years defending against high-altitude bombers, were utterly helpless in the face of this new type of assault. They could not adjust in time, and their guns, which had proven effective in previous engagements, were no match for the B-25's sustained firepower. The American planners behind the B-25's modification had carefully studied the Japanese Navy's defenses, and they had found a critical flaw: the inability to defend against a low-altitude, high-speed assault. The shock of facing an attack that came from the ocean surface was unparalleled. For the Japanese sailors, it was as if the laws of warfare had changed overnight. The B-25's didn't just attack from unexpected angles. They attacked with a fury that no one could have predicted. As one Japanese officer later described, it felt as though a giant, invisible hand had reached out and crushed everything in its path. The sheer speed at which the B-25's descended, their low-flying approach, and the concentrated fire they unleashed left the defenders no time to react. There was no warning, no opportunity to retaliate. While the Japanese sailors were still reeling from the first wave of attacks, the B-25's made another pass, unleashing more firepower and sending even more destruction across the convoy. The element of surprise did not just lie in the unexpected low-altitude attack. It was a devastating effectiveness of the B-25's weapons. The bomber's machine guns tore through ships with such force that the sound of the rounds tearing into the steel of the destroyers and transports was deafening. The sight of the tracer rounds cutting through the air, accompanied by the thundering sound of the bombardment, created an atmosphere of sheer panic. There was nowhere to hide. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that seemed to appear out of nowhere was as destructive as the physical damage. The Japanese Navy had no answer to this new form of warfare. The surprise element of the B-25 attack shifted the balance of power on the battlefield. The once proud Japanese Navy, which had relied on its heavy anti-aircraft defenses and naval superiority, found itself unable to defend against the innovative American bomber. In a matter of minutes, the tide of the battle had shifted. The surprise of the B-25's arrival was compounded by the terror it caused. The Japanese sailors, who had survived countless battles, found themselves helpless, and many were left questioning the very foundations of their naval doctrine. The success of the B-25's in the Bismarck Sea marked a new chapter in the history of aerial combat, one where innovation and surprise could turn the tide of war in an instant. The chaos and devastation that unfolded in the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, were unlike anything the Japanese Navy had experienced. The sight of their ships being torn apart by the B-25 Mitchell bombers was a surreal and horrifying spectacle. The Shirayuki, the first destroyer to fall victim to the B-25's, quickly became a floating inferno. As Major Edward Linder led the charge with his B-25 nicknamed Ruthless, the first round from a bomber's 8.50 caliber machine guns raked across the Shirayuki's bridge, tearing into the ship's structure with brutal force. The rapid-fire streams of tracer rounds lit up the sky in a deadly arc, casting an eerie glow across the surface of the water. Each round, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, struck with such force that it punched through the steel of the Shirayuki as if it were paper, igniting fires and tearing apart vital components of the ship. The destruction was almost instantaneous. The Shirayuki's bridge was reduced to rubble as glass shattered and steel buckled. The sailors aboard the ship, most of them unaware of the devastation that was about to strike, were suddenly thrust into a nightmare. Within seconds, the ship's command structure had been decimated and anti-aircraft positions were silenced. The sheer speed of the B-25's, coupled with their devastating firepower, left the defenders little time to react. The Shirayuki, once a symbol of Japanese naval power, was now sinking into the sea, her crew decimated by the relentless fire. As the B-25's continued their attack, they targeted the transport ships in the convoy with the same precision and overwhelming power. The Kenbaru, one of the largest transports, was struck next. With its hull pierced by armor-piercing incendiary rounds, the transport ship was immediately ablaze. The crew on board had no chance to escape as the bombs followed the strafing runs, smashing into the ship's hull. The fire quickly spread throughout the ship, consuming everything in its path. The intense heat from the burning ammunition and fuel could be felt even by the survivors who had been thrown into the water. The screams of soldiers trapped inside the Kenbaru's holds echoed through the chaos, but there was no one to hear them over the roar of the B-25 engines and the explosions that rocked the sea. The B-25's, not satisfied with just the strafing attacks, followed up with their deadly skip bombs. The bombs, designed to bounce across the surface of the water, struck the hulls of the transport with a force that could only be described as catastrophic. On the Kakushi Maru, the first bomb hit just below the waterline, sending a shockwave through the ship's interior. Seconds later, another bomb struck, causing the ship to break apart. The crew, disoriented and bleeding from the strafing fire, had no way to fight back. The Tio Maru, another transport ship, became the next target. As Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy of the Royal Australian Air Force dove toward the ship, his four 20mm cannons fired in rapid succession, tearing into the ship's superstructure. The sound of explosions filled the air as the T.O. Maru's bridge disintegrated under the impact, throwing sailors into the air. The ship's hull was soon punctured by skip bombs, sending it to the bottom of the sea. The transport sank swiftly, leaving only a burning wreck in its place. The scene on the water was a nightmarish vision of destruction. Burning ships littered the Bismarck Sea, their smoke rising into the sky, visible for miles. The once proud Japanese convoy, which had been carefully planned and meticulously executed, was now a chaotic scene of sinking wrecks and floating debris. The soldiers aboard these ships, many of whom had never faced such a brutal assault, were now stranded in the open sea, fighting to survive. The psychological toll of witnessing their comrades and ships being torn apart by an enemy they couldn't even see was as devastating as a physical destruction. The Japanese Navy, which had once believed in its dominance of the seas, now found itself powerless against this new weapon, a force that turned their ships into floating funeral pyres. The American innovation behind the B-25 Mitchell's transformation into a strafing gunship marked a turning point not only in aviation history, but also in naval warfare. The idea of turning a medium bomber, originally designed for high-altitude bombings, into a low-altitude, heavily armed flying gunship was a testament to American ingenuity. Major Paul of Ingun, recognizing the limitations of traditional bombing techniques against fast-moving naval targets, sought a more effective means of attacking Japanese convoys. He realized that high-altitude bombing was not ideal for hitting moving ships, and the typical torpedo runs required extensive training and precision. Rather than relying on standard military doctrine, Gunn and his team focused on a practical solution: modify a bomber to carry forward-facing machine guns, allowing for strafing attacks at low altitudes, which will be far more effective against moving ships. Working alongside Jack Falk from North American Aviation, Gunn began experimenting with the B-25 bomber at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane, Australia. The process was not without its challenges. The B-25 was not designed to carry such heavy armament in its nose, so significant structural reinforcements were required. The team installed 8.50 caliber machine guns in the bomber's nose, replacing the standard bomb bay and crew positions. The aircraft's nose had to be strengthened to bear the weight and recoil of the guns, while the ammunition storage was expanded to accommodate the huge amount of rounds the aircraft would unleash during its attacks. These modifications, though difficult, created a weapon capable of delivering devastating firepower with unprecedented precision. Each B-25, now equipped with 8 machine guns, could fire 6,800 rounds per minute, a formidable rate of fire that could tear through the steel of enemy ships in seconds. The B-25's new role as a strafing gunship proved to be a game-changer. Once the modified B-25s took to the skies over the Bismarck Sea, the impact was immediate. The modified bombers were able to approach their targets at low altitudes, bypassing the traditional defenses of high-altitude bombers, such as anti-aircraft fire aimed at much higher flight paths. With a steep dive, the B-25s could get close enough to unleash their devastating firepower at close range. The rounds fired from their 8 guns were armor-piercing and incendiary, meaning they not only punched through the steel of the ships but also set them on fire. This combination of firepower, speed, and low-altitude maneuverability allowed the B-25s to attack targets with unmatched effectiveness, leaving the Japanese ships vulnerable to assault in a way that had never been seen before. The B-25 Mitchell's transformation into a flying gunship was not only a testament to mechanical ingenuity but also to tactical innovation. American pilots quickly adapted to their new weapon, developing precise attack strategies that maximized the effectiveness of their firepower. Pilots would approach their targets at low altitudes, maintaining speed while firing continuously with all 8 guns aimed at enemy ships. Once they had inflicted maximum damage with their strafing runs, they would follow up with bombs, ensuring that their targets were thoroughly incapacitated. This combination of strafing and bombing at low altitude created an overwhelming assault that left the Japanese Navy helpless. The success of these tactics led to the rapid deployment of B-25 strafers across the Pacific Theater, where they became a standard tool in the American arsenal against Japanese convoys. The success of the B-25 Mitchell as a gunship also had a far-reaching impact beyond World War II. The concept of modifying existing aircraft to create more effective weapons influenced future developments in military aviation, especially in the design of gunships. The AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre gunships, used during the Vietnam War and subsequent conflicts, were direct descendants of the B-25 Straffer. These aircraft, like the B-25, were designed for close air support and ground attack, relying on a combination of firepower and maneuverability to defeat enemy forces. The success of the B-25 Mitchell in turning the tide of naval warfare in the Pacific showed the potential of adapting existing technology to meet the demands of a changing battlefield. In many ways, the B-25 transformation was a precursor to modern military aviation, where innovation and adaptability continue to be key factors in achieving success. The destruction unleashed by the B-25 Mitchell bombers in the Bismarck Sea was a sight of pure chaos and terror. As the modified B-25 swooped down from low altitudes, the very atmosphere seemed to vibrate with the noise of their 8.50 caliber machine guns opening fire. The Japanese sailors aboard the convoy ships, once so confident in their naval superiority, were suddenly faced with a new kind of terror. The tracer rounds from the B-25s created vivid streaks of light across the sky, a deadly trail marking the path of destruction. Each B-25 bomber, with its 8 machine guns firing in unison, unleashed a storm of bullets that rained down upon the Japanese ships below. The sound of the rounds tearing through the air was deafening, and the explosion of tracer rounds piercing through metal was accompanied by the sickening sound of ship structures being torn apart. The Shiryuki, one of the first ships to come under fire, was transformed from a proud destroyer into a flaming wreck in mere seconds. The B-25s had made no attempt to attack from the typical high-altitude bombing approach that the Japanese were accustomed to. Instead, they came in low, from the horizon, like silent predators. The Shiryuki's crew had no chance to react before the first barrage hit. The tracer rounds tore through the destroyer's bridge, shattering windows and killing anyone in sight. The Japanese sailors, who had once prided themselves on their ability to withstand air attacks, now found themselves helpless against this new and terrifying form of warfare. The rapid-fire gunfire destroyed anti-aircraft positions, incapacitating the ship's defenses and leaving them unable to respond. Within moments, the Shiryuki was ablaze, its once pristine superstructure a twisted, burning mass. As the B-25 circled and came around for their next strafing run, the scene became one of complete devastation. The Japanese destroyers and transport ships in the convoy, now vulnerable and exposed, were subjected to a barrage of fire unlike any they had faced before. The Kakushi Maru, another transport ship, was hit next. The first few rounds from the B-25s tore into the ship's superstructure, obliterating the command center and killing many of the crew. The ship began to list heavily to one side as the bombardment continued, and fire quickly spread throughout the vessel. The intense heat from the flames could be felt from a distance, as plumes of smoke began to rise from the ship. The bombers then unleashed their skip bombs, which struck the hull of the transport just below the waterline. The bombs skipped like stones across the surface of a pond, slamming into the vulnerable ship and sending it to the bottom of the sea. The Kakushi Maru, once carrying soldiers, ammunition, and supplies, was now a sunken grave, lost beneath the waves. The terror didn't end with the ships themselves. The survivors, thrown into the churning waters of the Bismarck Sea, found no refuge. As the sinking ships created waves, the survivors, gasping for breath, watched in horror as the B-25s came around for another pass. The bombers, with their deadly guns still blazing, targeted the lifeboats and swimmers, mowing down anyone who attempted to escape. The B-25s were relentless, their strafing runs unyielding as they poured fire onto the already desperate survivors. The sea, once a place of refuge, now seemed like an inescapable trap, with the survivors knowing they could not hide from the attack. As more ships went down and more bodies fell into the sea, the entire scene became a horrifying spectacle of destruction. The sky, once clear, was now filled with smoke, and the water was alive with the splashes of bombs and the sinking wreckage of ships. The once organized convoy had been reduced to a scattered collection of burning, sinking wrecks. It was as if the very ocean had been turned into a battlefield, with the survivors struggling to hold on to life amid the carnage. The aftermath of the B-25 strafing attack in the Bismarck Sea had far-reaching consequences, particularly in how it reshaped Japanese naval doctrine. What Admiral Kimura had believed to be a routine convoy operation, one where their superior naval strategies would guarantee success, had turned into a devastating nightmare. The loss of 8 transports, including their precious cargo of soldiers, ammunition, and supplies, alongside the sinking or crippling of 4 destroyers, shattered the once unshakable confidence the Japanese Navy had in its ability to control the seas. The sheer speed and effectiveness of the B-25 Mitchell bombers forced the Japanese to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their naval doctrine, which had been built on decades of experience and historical victories, was now inadequate in the face of an entirely new form of warfare. The psychological blow to the Japanese Navy was immediate and profound. Many of the sailors and officers who had survived the attack were left in disbelief, unable to comprehend the ferocity of the American assault. Their traditional methods of air defense, including high-altitude bombing, torpedo runs, and anti-aircraft fire, had proven effective in the past, but none of these strategies had been designed to counter the B-25's low-altitude strafing runs. The 8-gun nose configuration, which had been developed from a practical need to engage ships effectively, was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. Their anti-aircraft defenses, once considered a reliable shield, were rendered useless against the B-25's rapid, concentrated fire at close range. The Japanese sailors, who had relied on maneuvering and evasive tactics to avoid air raids, now found themselves defenseless against the overwhelming firepower unleashed by the American bombers. This unprecedented attack forced the Japanese military to reconsider its entire approach to naval warfare. The B-25 strafers had proven that low-altitude, high-speed strikes could bypass traditional defenses and deliver catastrophic damage. The psychological terror the attack had instilled among the surviving crews left an indelible mark on the Japanese Navy. As one survivor later described, the B-25 seemed like flying machines of destruction, and no matter how fast the ships maneuvered or how many anti-aircraft rounds were fired, there was no escaping the hail of gunfire. The attack was more than just a physical defeat. It was a devastating blow to the morale of the entire fleet. In the wake of the Bismarck Sea disaster, Japanese naval officers were forced to rethink their strategies. The traditional focus on surface warfare, which had been the cornerstone of their naval doctrine, now seemed inadequate in the face of the new threat posed by the B-25's. The Japanese military, which had long considered air attacks to be secondary to the power of their ships, now found themselves forced to develop new tactics to defend against low-flying, heavily armed bombers. Attempts to increase the number of anti-aircraft guns on their ships were only marginally effective, as the sheer volume of fire from the B-25's made it nearly impossible to defend against. In the following months, the Japanese Navy would begin to explore desperate measures, such as mounting more anti-aircraft weapons and developing new fighter tactics, but these efforts were often too little, too late. The impact of the B-25 attack on Japanese naval operations in the Pacific was profound. By the time of the attack on the convoy in the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese Navy had already been stretched thin by multiple engagements across the Pacific. The loss of reinforcements, crucial supplies, and experienced personnel during the attack on March 3rd would only worsen their logistical problems. In subsequent months, the Japanese Navy became increasingly cautious, avoiding daylight operations in areas within B-25 range. The once dominant force was now crippled by a new, innovative weapon that had rendered traditional naval strategies ineffective. The shift in Japanese naval tactics, although a direct result of the B-25 strafing attack, would not prevent their eventual defeat in the Pacific. The effectiveness of the B-25 gunships, paired with the growing dominance of American air power, ensured that the Japanese Navy could no longer rely on its past successes to maintain its grip on the Pacific. The B-25's, with their innovative design and devastating effectiveness, became one of the most feared weapons in the war, shaping the future of aerial combat and naval strategy for years to come. The B-25 Mitchell bombers, with their innovative 8-gun noses, had forever altered the course of naval warfare. What had begun as a tactical experiment in Australian workshops had evolved into a weapon of unimaginable destruction. The attack on the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea, carried out in March 1943, was the first of many encounters that would showcase the true potential of this flying gunship. In just a few short hours, the B-25 had turned the tide of war in the Pacific, demonstrating that technological innovation, driven by necessity, could change the very nature of combat. The shock and devastation felt by the Japanese Navy in the aftermath of the attack was unlike any previous loss. The traditional belief in their naval superiority, built on years of experience and tactical dominance, was shattered. The loss of the convoy, along with thousands of soldiers and critical supplies, marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in Japan's naval strategies. The psychological toll on the surviving sailors, many of whom were left in a state of disbelief and terror, was profound. No longer could the Japanese Navy rely on its previous methods of defense, nor could they continue to operate with the same confidence that had once made them a formidable force. The B-25 strafers had not only devastated their ships, they had struck at the heart of Japan's naval doctrine, forcing a complete rethinking of their approach to warfare. For the United States, the B-25 Mitchell's transformation into a deadly gunship was an unequivocal success. The decision to modify existing bombers rather than wait for a new, purpose-built aircraft allowed the American military to capitalize on a rapidly evolving war. This adaptation was a direct reflection of American ingenuity and resourcefulness, turning a conventional bomber into a terror of the Pacific skies. The B-25's low-altitude, high-speed attack tactics proved to be a game-changer, shifting the balance of power and providing American forces with an unprecedented advantage over the Japanese Navy. The innovation didn't stop at the Bismarck Sea. The success of the B-25s led to the rapid deployment of these modified bombers across the Pacific, where they would go on to terrorize Japanese convoys, shipping lanes, and even airfields. As the B-25 strafers gained notoriety, they would continue to prove their worth in various theaters of the Pacific War, evolving alongside the tactics and strategies employed by the American military. The B-25's influence on the course of the war extended far beyond its immediate impact on the Japanese Navy. It changed the way future conflicts would be fought, ushering in a new era of aerial combat. The legacy of the B-25 Mitchell as a strafing gunship, however, did not end with World War II. The lessons learned from its use directly influenced the design and tactics of future gunship aircraft, including the iconic AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre gunships used in later conflicts such as the Vietnam War. The idea of heavily arming an aircraft for close air support and ground attack was solidified, showing that ingenuity and adaptation could outperform even the most advanced purpose-built weapon systems. The B-25, once an unassuming medium bomber, had proven that creativity and resourcefulness in the face of adversity could shape the future of military aviation. For Japan, the loss of the Bismarck Sea convoy marked the beginning of a slow and inevitable decline in their naval power. The inability to defend against the B-25 strafers and the subsequent shift in naval doctrine signaled the end of their dominance in the Pacific. While Japan would continue to fight valiantly, they could never recover from the loss of their ability to protect their sea lanes from the air. The B-25 Mitchell had not just destroyed ships, it had destroyed the very foundation of Japanese naval superiority. In the grand scope of history, the B-25 Mitchell's role in the Pacific War serves as a powerful reminder of how innovation can change the course of warfare. It was not the most advanced or the most powerful weapon on paper, but its adaptability, effectiveness, and devastating impact proved that necessity is the mother of invention. And in the case of the B-25 strafers, that invention would leave an indelible mark on military strategy for generations to come.